Picture a Neolithic village, maybe 9,000 years ago. A clay pot sits near a fire. Inside it, a mix of wild grain and water that someone left out a few days too long. Someone drinks it anyway, and then something strange happens. The world tilts slightly. Things feel warmer, funnier. The edges of the day go soft. Was that the first hangover in human history? Maybe. But here's the more interesting question. Was it an accident at all? Because the more archaeologists dig into this, the more they find evidence that ancient humans weren't just stumbling onto fermented drinks by chance. They were actively, deliberately, obsessively making them. Tens of thousands of years before writing, before metal tools, before cities, our ancestors had figured out how to get drunk. And the story of how we know that and what it meant for the species is genuinely one of the strangest threads in human history. Let's go back even further than that clay pot. One of the oldest fermented beverages ever found was discovered in a cave in Israel called Raqefet Cave. The site dates to roughly 13,000 years ago, and it belonged to a group of people called the Natufians. These were hunter-gatherers. No agriculture, no permanent settlements in the traditional sense. They were not supposed to be brewers. But archaeologists found stone mortars carved directly into the cave floor, large enough to hold dozens of liters of liquid. Inside the residue on those stones, they found chemical traces of wheat and barley starch, along with evidence that those starches had been fermented. The leading interpretation is that the Natufians were making a kind of beer, a thick, porridge-like fermented grain drink, probably for use in feasting rituals connected to their burial practices. Think about what that means for a moment. These people were brewing beer before they were farming grain, before they even had a permanent address. That single fact has been quietly reshaping the way historians think about agriculture itself. For most of the 20th century, the standard explanation for why humans began farming went something like this. Population pressure built up, wild food sources became insufficient, and clever humans figured out that planting and harvesting grain was more reliable than hunting and foraging. Agriculture was the practical solution to a caloric problem. It's a tidy explanation. It's also probably incomplete. Because here's the awkward detail. The earliest cultivated grains were not particularly good to eat. Wild wheat and barley are tough, bitter, not especially nutritious compared to the rich diet of a successful hunter-gatherer. Early agricultural communities actually show signs of nutritional decline compared to their foraging predecessors. Shorter stature, more dental disease, less dietary variety. So why would anyone voluntarily make that trade? One increasingly influential theory, sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis, suggests that the pull toward agriculture wasn't just about calories. It was about fermentation. Grain fermented into alcohol was socially transformative. It enabled feasting, ritual, social bonding at a scale that was hard to achieve otherwise. And if you wanted a reliable supply of that, you needed a reliable supply of grain, which meant you needed to grow it. The drink may have come before the farm. This idea was first proposed in the 1950s by an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood, who asked somewhat dryly whether it was the desire for bread or for beer that first led people to settle down and grow grain. At the time, it was considered a bit eccentric. Decades later, with the chemical residue evidence piling up, it's looking considerably less eccentric. Now, to be fair, most researchers today don't think it was beer alone that drove agriculture. The relationship between fermentation and farming was probably more of a feedback loop than a clean cause and effect. People grew grain. Some of it fermented. They liked what fermentation produced. That gave them extra motivation to grow more grain. Repeat for several thousand years. But the point is that alcohol wasn't a side effect of civilization. It may have been one of its engines. So how did ancient people actually make these drinks? Let's be specific because the process is both simpler and stranger than most people expect. The key to fermentation is converting starches into sugars and then letting yeast convert those sugars into alcohol. Modern brewers do this with malted grain, which means grain that has been allowed to sprout, activating enzymes that break down the starches. Ancient brewers used a more direct method in many cultures. They chewed the grain. Human saliva contains an enzyme called amylase, which does exactly the same job as malting. You chew the grain, spit it into a container, add water, and the enzymes do their work. This technique was used in ancient Mesoamerica to make chicha, a fermented corn drink that has been produced continuously for thousands of years and is still made this way in parts of the Andes today. It is communal, labor-intensive, and oddly intimate. Everyone in the village might contribute to the chewing. The drink that results belongs to everyone. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the approach was different. Brewers there used a combination of malted grain and baked bread as their starch sources, crumbling the bread into water and allowing fermentation to begin. Egyptian beer was thick and nutrient-dense, closer to a liquid porridge than what we'd recognize today. It was a dietary staple consumed by workers, soldiers, and priests alike. The laborers who built the pyramids at Giza were paid partly in beer, roughly 4 to 5 liters per day per worker, according to records from the site. This wasn't a perk. It was part of the wage structure. Beer was calories, hydration, social currency, and religious offering all at once. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia left us one of the oldest written recipes in human history. It's a hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, and it doubles as a detailed brewing guide. It describes soaking malt, baking it into special loaves, crumbling those loaves into a fermenting vat, and waiting. The hymn dates to around 1800 BCE, but the techniques it describes were almost certainly far older. What were these drinks actually like to consume? This is where it gets interesting because ancient fermented beverages were not the clear, carbonated, standardized products we're used to. They were variable, they were cloudy. They were often mixed with herbs, honey, resins, and spices, and their alcohol content fluctuated depending on the batch. Archaeobotanists have found residues in ancient vessels that suggest brewers were adding things like henbane, wormwood, mandrake, and other psychoactive plants to their drinks. Some researchers believe this was intentional, to amplify or alter the effect. Others think some of these additives were primarily for preservation or flavor. The line between beer, medicine, and ritual substance was blurry in the ancient world, and possibly deliberately so. One of the most striking examples of ancient fermented drink culture comes from a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. This is a site that keeps upending what we thought we knew about prehistory. It's a massive complex of carved stone pillars and enclosures, built by hunter-gatherers approximately 11 to 12,000 years ago. That makes it older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the Great Pyramid by 7,000 years, and whoever built it was not supposed to exist yet. These were pre-agricultural people who somehow organized the labor to quarry, transport, and carve enormous limestone blocks, some weighing up to 20 tons, on a hilltop in what is now southeastern Turkey. How did you feed and motivate that labor force? Archaeologists at the site have found enormous stone vessels, some capable of holding over 150 liters of liquid. Chemical analysis suggests these were used to ferment grain-based beverages. The working theory is that feasting and communal drinking were central to how the builders of Göbekli Tepe organized collective labor. People came, they drank together, they worked together. They built something that lasted 12,000 years. There's a social technology at work here that's easy to underestimate. Alcohol in the context of these ancient communities wasn't primarily about individual intoxication. It was about group cohesion. The shared experience of altering consciousness together in a ritual setting builds a kind of trust and solidarity that is hard to manufacture any other way. Anthropologists sometimes call this communal effervescence, borrowing a term from the sociologist Emil Durkheim, who observed that shared altered states, whether from music, dance, ritual, or substances, create powerful bonds between people. Ancient brewers may not have had the vocabulary for this, but they clearly understood the effect. Fermented drinks appear at burials, at temples, at harvest festivals, at coronations. Wherever something socially important was happening, the drink was there. Let's talk about wine, because grain wasn't the only fermentation game in town. The oldest confirmed winery in the world was found in Armenia in a cave called Areni 1. It dates to approximately 6,000 years ago and includes a grape press, fermentation vats, storage jars, and a cup, all arranged in what looks like a dedicated production space. But grape seeds showing signs of cultivation go back at least 8,000 years in the South Caucasus region, suggesting that winemaking traditions are older still. China adds another layer to this picture. Analysis of pottery fragments from a Neolithic site called Jiahu, dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, revealed a fermented mixture of rice, honey, and fruit, specifically hawthorn berries or grapes. This isn't quite wine and isn't quite beer. It's something that doesn't have a modern equivalent, a hybrid fermented beverage that was being produced at roughly the same time as the earliest known examples anywhere else in the world. What this distribution tells us is striking. From China to the Caucasus to the Levant to Mexico, human communities that had no contact with each other all independently arrived at fermentation. This is not something that got invented once and spread. It was discovered over and over again wherever people had carbohydrates and patience. The drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley in 2000, offers one explanation for why. The idea is that our primate ancestors were drawn to the smell of ethanol, Because ripe, fermenting fruit was a reliable caloric signal. Fruit that smells slightly alcoholic is at peak ripeness. Our attraction to that smell and to the mild intoxicating effect of naturally fermented juice may be a sensory inheritance from millions of years of primate evolution. We may be hardwired to find fermented things appealing, not because of culture, but because of deep evolutionary history. This doesn't mean ancient people were constantly intoxicated. It means the attraction to these substances had a biological foundation that predated human culture by a very long time. Culture then built elaborate structures on top of that foundation. Rules about who could drink, when, how much, in what context, for what purpose. Almost every ancient society that produced fermented drinks also produced rules about those drinks. In Mesopotamia, taverns were regulated by law codes. In ancient China, certain officials were forbidden from drinking during specific periods of the year. In ancient Greece, wine was always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered barbaric, a sign of someone who hadn't been properly civilized. The rules themselves tell us something important. You only need rules about something if it's both powerful and potentially disruptive. The fact that every ancient civilization felt the need to regulate fermented drinks is itself evidence of how central those drinks were to social life. And there's one more piece to this that tends to get left out of the sanitized version of history. Ancient people knew these drinks could be dangerous. They knew about excess. They wrote about it. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest works of literature in the world, features a scene where the wild man Enkidu is civilized by drinking beer and wine. He drinks, he becomes human, he joins society. But the same texts contain warnings about overindulgence. The Sumerians had proverbs about it. The Egyptians had cautionary inscriptions. The tension between the social benefits of fermented drinks and their capacity for harm was recognized from the beginning. Ancient people were not naive about this. They were navigating the same complicated relationship with alcohol that humans still navigate today, just without the epidemiological studies. So, where does this leave us? Ancient humans absolutely got drunk. They did it deliberately, skillfully, and with considerable sophistication. They got drunk at funerals and at harvest festivals and at temple ceremonies. And at the end of a long day of moving 20-ton limestone blocks, they flavored their drinks with herbs and honey and resins. They dedicated goddesses to the craft of brewing. They paid their workers in fermented grain. And the evidence suggests that this wasn't just a habit that developed alongside civilization. It may have been one of the forces that shaped civilization in the first place, binding communities together, motivating collective labor, marking the transitions of human life with something shared and transformative. The clay pot by the fire, the water and grain left out too long, someone who decided to drink it anyway. That person set something in motion that has been running ever since. 13,000 years of fermentation, feasting, ritual, and regulation. 12,000 years of building impossible things together after sharing something from a common vessel. The drink that made the world stranger also, in a very real sense, helped make the world.